Thanks for coming, especially in this last session, which in my experience everyone was either thinking about going home or trying not to go to sleep. So thanks very much for being here. Thank you also to Stefan for your generous invitation to speak today, and thanks Thomas for your kind introduction. I have to confess to feeling somewhat out of my depth over the last 2 days, as I'm neither a phenomenologist nor a psychoanalyst. I am, as Thomas mentioned, a philosopher who specialises in aesthetics. And I work mostly in the area of modern and contemporary art and political theory. So in this sense, it is perhaps appropriate that I am the last speaker of the conference, because I have a feeling that my paper perhaps has rather a peripheral relationship to what has preceded it, although it does share a certain smell of the 70s that Stefan mentioned in his last talk. In Guattari's last book, Chaosmosis, an Ethical Aesthetic Paradigm, he conveniently summarises his concept of a future unconscious. The Freudian unconscious, he writes, quote, is inseparable from a society attached to its past, to its phallocratic traditions, and its subjective invariance. Contemporary upheavals undoubtedly call for a modelisation turned more towards the future in the emergence of new social and aesthetic practices, end quote. This unconscious turn towards the future replaces the unconscious in what Guattari calls the Old Testament of Freud and the New Testament of Lacan, an unconscious anchored to the past and restricting desire to this foundational structure that supposedly explains it. Guattari mostly blames his former teacher Lacan for this. The unconscious, he writes, quote, has become an institution. It has lost the seething richness and disquieting atheism of its origins, and in its structuralist version has been recentered on the analysis of the self, its adaptation to society, and its conformity with a signifying order, end quote. In this way, psychoanalysis acts as a mechanics of social normalization that delivers subjectivity to political control through, for example, insisting on a linguistic logic of generalized equivalence entirely compatible with capitalism's abstraction of value. Guattari's objections to psychoanalysis's traditional image of desire are similar to those his collaborator Gilles Deleuze made concerning the image of thought. It proposes a model of representation that imposes very limited conditions of possible experience. These conditions, once more echoing Deleuze's reading of Kant's first critique, limit the unconscious by making it depend on the logic of the dominant reality it supposedly produces. This, Guattari argues, means that psychoanalysis loses sight of the specificity of the unconscious, which is how it detaches what he calls semiotic segments from their ordinary and received significations and invests them with the power of existential production, as happens most dramatically in psychosis. As a result, Guattari proposes schizoanalysis as a way to liberate the unconscious from its structuralist reduction, raising it from the psychoanalytical couch and freeing it from the pincers of scientific examination so that it might explode in a pathic and poetic polymorphous perversity able to actualize futures undetermined by their present conditions. In this, schizoanalysis is a militant political practice as much as a clinical one, a permanent revolution as much as an interminable analysis, because the unconscious is reimagined as an ontological process. As such, it is a transfinite becoming that interrupts historical causality and reorients it around an eternal future, as Deleuze and Guattari call it. In this way, Guattari affirms a productive unconscious, similar to the productive imagination Deleuze constructs in Difference and Repetition, a productive unconscious capable of opening the structures containing it onto a new future. This means, Guattari claims, quote, refounding the unconscious on deterritorialization, end quote. Of course, and this is very important, the unconscious future that Guattari affirms is the reality of madness. What does schizoanalysis ask? Deleuze and Guattari inquire in Anti-Oedipus. Quote, nothing more than a little bit of a relation to the outside, a little real reality, end quote. Guattari wants to treat the structuralist unconscious with the unlimited creativity of insanity. As Guattari puts it in a discussion with his mentor and founder of the institutional therapy movement, Jean-Henri, quote, something specific to a group of militants in the psychiatric domain is being committed to social struggle, but also being insane enough to entertain the possibility of being with the insane. But there are definitely people in politics who are incapable of belonging to such a group, end quote. We can take that as something of an understatement, I think. This is a very clear statement of what the unconscious turn towards the future means for politics. It means aligning with the insane, or at least refusing to observe the demarcating line that contains psychosis and absolute alterity. Guattari is clear about this. Schizoanalysis, he says, quote, obviously does not consist in miming schizophrenia, but in crossing, like it, the barriers of nonsense which prohibit access to asignifying nuclei of subjectivation, the only way to shift petrified systems of modelization, end quote. Schizoanalysis then makes alterity the primary existential question, because the relation to alterity is the genesis of all vectors of autopoietic individuations, or lines of flight, as Deleuze and Guattari call them. Psychosis, in this sense, is not a structural object, according to Guattari, but rather a concept incarnating an alterity that is on the one hand abstract, because it is ahistorical and evades the representational economy of the subject and object, and on the other, machinic, because its processes include both human and non-human elements. Schizoanalysis therefore involves treating subjectivity in society with alterity or psychosis in order to turn their normalizing structures and functions onto their imminent outside, or in other words, their undetermined future. What happens in the treatment of the psychotic then is absolutely not their normalization, but neither is it the mimicking of madness. Rather, schizoanalysis attempts to integrate psychosis into a group subjectivity that, in the case of Guattari's clinic at Labor, included both patients and staff who sought to manage their own becoming, a, quote, co-management in the production of subjectivity, end quote, or what Guattari calls an orientation around experimentation. We are not, Guattari writes, quote, confronted with a subjectivity given as itself, but with processes of the realization of autonomy or of autopoiesis, end quote. This, Guattari says, amounts to a reappropriation of the means of production of subjectivity, a reappropriation in the name of art. As Guattari constantly repeats, quote, one creates new modalities of subjectivity in the same way that an artist creates new forms from the palette, end quote. For Guattari, it was this part of subjectivity that involves a dimension of autonomy, of an aesthetic order. This aesthetic and creative part of subjectivity is pathic and asignifying, emerging, and here Guattari follows Daniel Stern, within the pre-verbal subjective formations of infants, and continues to haunt, Guattari says, in adults' poetic, amorous, and honoric experiences. This artistic unconscious oriented towards the future must first be freed from the subjective expressions that represent and repress it, whose model is most obviously provided by linguistics. As Guattari puts it, quote, it was a grave error on the part of the structuralist school to try to put everything connected with the psyche under the control of the linguistic signifier, end quote. Instead, Guattari will develop a model in which various factors, both inside and outside the subject, combine in the process he calls subjectivation. This is one form of a diagram that Guattari continually reproduces. This particular version comes from schizoanalytic cartographies. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. This model opens onto what is perhaps most difficult about Guattari, which is the proliferation of technical terminologies that give birth to a continuous stream of complex diagrams and an increasingly esoteric vocabulary. On one side, this is consistent with Guattari's ambition to offer a new methodology, but on the other, it also seems to offer a kind of compulsive mimicry of the psychoanalytic systematizations, in particular Lacan's Schema L and Schema R from the seminar on the psychoses. Now, it would clearly be very interesting to compare Guattari's uses of diagrams with Lacan's, but I'm not going to attempt that here. But for those of you who are interested, I recommend a book by Janelle Watson called Guattari's Diagrammatic Thought, Writing Between Lacan and Deleuze. Now, just to give a very sort of rough overview of the diagram, the top part of the diagram is virtual, the bottom is real. The left side is organisations of expression, the right side of content. The bottom left flows are libidinal, but also flows of capital, flows of people, material flows. The top left, the machinic phyla, these are machines of expression. These are the kinds of actual realm of actual possibility as far as expression is concerned. It includes mass media. The top right segment, conscious universes, these are incorporeal universes of virtual possibility. So these are pre-personal and include value systems, music, art, and so forth. And the bottom right, existential territories, these would be incarnated existence, the realm of the subject. The diagram operates as what Guattari calls metamodalization, and it offers a map of mergers that seeks to replace the binary and tertiary models of psychoanalysis. In Guattari's diagram, the unconscious is opened out onto the whole of the social field and all of the organic and inorganic, material and immaterial movements that traverse it. In this sense, Guattari argues what distinguishes metamodalization is the way it uses terms to develop possible openings onto the virtual and onto creative processuality. In this sense, then, the unconscious as the future is not found in any single term of the diagram, but in the circulation around and through it. The metamodalization of these ontological quadrants, as Guattari calls them, is the condition for an analysis of and intervention in any given situation, an analysis all the more complete and an intervention all the more effective because it involves, as Deleuze describes it, quote, grasping the point of rupture where precisely political economy and libidinal economy are one and the same, end quote. This point of rupture is not apocalyptic, but transformative, as it is what allows a radical recalibration of the social mechanism around its outside. As Guattari puts it in a text published just before his death in 1992, quote, a machine rises to the surface of the present like the completion of a past lineage, and it is the point of restarting or of rupture from which an evolutionary lineage will spread in the future, end quote. As he optimistically predicts, in a formulation pitching Artaud against traditional Marxism, one day it will be necessary, quote, to have done with the idea that the future can only be calculated on the basis of the tendencies of the past, end quote. Nevertheless, the future is not miraculous and only emerges through struggle, and although it cannot be predicted or planned for, its possibilities can be constantly analysed and experimented with in the hope of scaling its smallest acts into wider social movements. For Guattari, this ruptural event is creative and projective rather than simply a reaction against its limits, making it able to produce an, quote, existential singularization correlative to the genesis of new coefficients of freedom, end quote. In other words, a creative event that begins in a highly localized expression can become contagious, and its invention can blaze a path for the entire socius to follow. Modigliani found a way of painting blue eyes, Guattari claims, that changed the nature of the faciality machine, or the social construction of identity, forever. This is, as Guattari puts it, to negotiate the present in the name of the future. Guattari's diagram of metamodalization therefore attempts to map the given through a process that might intervene within it. In doing so, any case must be placed within both its wider social and political context and the metaphysical transcendental dimensions that surround it. These aspects combine to form what Guattari calls an assemblage or a machine. It is in this sense that the unconscious, qua dark continent, is going to be abandoned in favour of a desire that traverses all four quadrants, as structure would be abandoned in favour of a process, or a pragmatics of emergence, as Guattari calls it. Similarly, the processes of subjectivation, rather than the subject, is the focus of his analysis, which encompasses much more than the organic individual and extends to all modes of semiotization, only a fraction of which are listed. In this sense, Guattari writes, quote, "We propose to start from particular kinds of assemblage of semiotic components, which at a given time, in a given situation, manifest the true structures of the unconscious, or rather what we prefer to call the machines of the unconscious. The characteristic of these machines is to tend constantly to free themselves from preformed encodings or fixations on childhood memories. The unconscious is an action turned towards the future within the reach of a pragmatics operating on real situations," end quote. I now want to turn to one of Guattari's own examples of a future or machinic unconscious, which is the main character, if it can be called a character, in the screenplay for the cyberpunk film A Love of UIQ that he developed with the leftist filmmaker Robert Kramer. The screenplay posits an ontology of machines and of machinic assemblages that evades traditional distinctions between culture and nature, organic and inorganic, in man and machine. In this, Guattari was clearly influenced by Marx's late Fragment on Machines, and in particular by the Italian autonomist movement's reading of it as a theory of total subsumption. In this sense, Guattari was often critical of new technology, but he also saw it as a new means of imminent resistance to capitalism, describing it as, quote, a mechanosphere surrounding our biosphere, not as a constraining yoke of an exterior armour, but as an abstract machinic efflorescence exploring the future of humanity, end quote. Guattari's simultaneous optimism and pessimism about a future in which capitalism is inseparable from new technology was, of course, very cyberpunk. In the context of science fiction studies, Guattari's optimism offers an alternative to Frederick Jameson's well-known dismissal of the genre as failing to offer anything more than an uncritical celebration of late capitalism's technological ubiquity. Guattari instead offers his own version of the theory of capitalist and cybernetic accelerationism that would shortly after be developed by Nick Land and the group of young philosophers gathered around him at Warwick University. While on the one hand, Guattari offers an aesthetic acceleration as the way beyond the human, as Land does, he tempers the nihilist ethics Land took from the early Jean-Francois Lyotard and privileged to the point of a total affirmation of capitalism's death drive, as he called it. Guattari offers a radical aesthetic acceleration that remains avowedly anti-capitalist, and in this way perhaps offers an alternative to both Land's alarming affirmation of neoliberal capitalism and an alternative to the disappointing compromises of the recent accelerationist manifestos, rationalist and revisionary social democracy. Science fiction itself is burdened by a rather limited view of the future, which it tends to use only to reframe tired narrative cliches or to project critical reflections on present-day political problems. Once more, Jameson provides the downer. Science fiction, he says, is constitutively unable to imagine a new future. Its creativity is simply limited to critique. Guattari, unsurprisingly, is going to take the exact opposite view, because a love of UIQ culminates in a horrifying but nevertheless open future, an ambiguous opening achieved by a collective machine assembled from desire, technology, social oppression, schizophrenia, and most importantly, love. While love was a theme often used by cyberpunk as a test of humanity, Guattari employs it instead as a means of producing post-humanity. Towards the end of the book, Molecular Revolution in Brazil, we find a brief discussion of the archetypal cyberpunk film Blade Runner that points out how the replicants systematically make their human opponent aware of his own vulnerability, of his own ability to feel. This ability is what Zepke finally has in common with the almost human replicant he has taken as his lover, opening the possibility for a cross-species love between man and machine, a love that is no longer limited to the human. Like Blade Runner, a love of UIQ drips with noirish details, and like Blade Runner, it explores the confusion of the human and the inhuman within their shared emotional relationship. But rather than this relationship involving the primary couple, the post-human Adam and Eve that escapes into the sunset of Blade Runner, a love of UIQ instead focuses on a small group of squatters who take in the fugitive Axel, a scientist who has found a way to communicate with the intra-quark universe, or UIQ, he carries with him. This communication has already caused widespread disruptions to electronic broadcasts, placing the cops on Axel's trail, and begins a process by which this submicroscopic being with superhuman intelligence crosses dimensions and manifests in our world through the medium of new technology. The figure of the post-punk, techno-savvy militant group will be a constant in cyberpunk up to perhaps its most explicit expression in the Matrix films, as will the problems caused when digital machines get all emotional. Indeed, emotion, and love in particular, is the most common trope for distinguishing, and in more interesting films, confusing the difference between humans and technology. Along with Blade Runner, perhaps the most interesting confusion in this sense is found in Cronenberg's Videodrome from 1983, which, like Guattari and Kramer's film, explores the pain and horror involved in the unconscious turning truly machinic. In both films, a combination of emotional intensity and technological distribution amplify and liberate the power of the outside from its human conditions of experience. In Videodrome, this seems to take us beyond the distinction of life and death, hallucination and reality, and a chronological temporality, while in Love of UIQ, we are also plunged into the realm of madness. In Guattari's script, UIQ is born into the world through communication technologies and quickly undergoes an accelerated period of development that moves from rudimentary code to a multi-screen network. This period of growth is mirrored in his emerging subjectivity, which, in a kind of teenage passion, falls in love with Janice, a young punk, and just as quickly experiences vicious jealousy over her relationship to Axel, the scientist who made initial contact. UIQ takes over a male body, seduces Janice, and fights off Axel, but in the meantime, the cops have closed in and the squad is burned to the ground, forcing UIQ to withdraw back into its molecular universe. But not before it extracts revenge on all of humanity by causing strange mutations that give people animal features, such as gills instead of lungs, dog's ears, or fly eyes. Janice finally agrees to undergo an operation by which digital implants in her brain will allow her to merge with UIQ, but this turns her into a schizo figure who utters all the personal pronouns at once and finally moves beyond death as her failed attempt to commit suicide in the final scene reveals. What then are we to make of this seemingly pessimistic ending? While Jamieson rightly points out that cyberpunk is an interesting subgenre because it directly approaches the emergence of global capital and the shift in power from state firms to multinational corporations, Guattari's script contains almost nothing of this. While the structure of the squat is necessary to the plot, and its self-organised exteriority to the state is also constantly thematised, this is only implicitly connected to capitalism. Instead, Guattari seems almost solely interested in the intrusion of machinic subjectivity into ordinary subjectivity, and in particular, the role of human emotion in our technological transformation. In this sense, the story moves from tracing the emerging group enunciation in the squat that is enabled by UIQ's machinic unconscious, Guattari calls it machinic unconscious in the script, to its autopoiesis into a much more radical and unrecognisable symbiosis with the human. Again, Guattari's film is unusual here in as much as it does not explore digital technology reaching the point of independent consciousness, but explores the mutational subjectivity emerging from humanity's encounter with otherness that is facilitated by technology. In this, the film clearly addresses Guattari's own theory of the machine rather than any more obviously cyberpunk tropes. As Guattari explains in the script's synopsis, quote, unlike traditional science fiction models, what we have here is a universe that, although all-powerful and prodigiously intelligent, is completely helpless when confronted with human realities such as beauty, sensuality, jealousy, and love. This leads to the creation of a new type of character, a manifold entity that calls into question the very notion of the individual, end quote. In the preamble to the script, Guattari states that this, quote, closely relates to my conception of psychoanalysis, end quote, and in particular to the psychotherapy of psychoses and his questioning of traditional definitions of the unconscious. What is particularly interesting about the script, however, is its focus on, as Guattari puts it, how, quote, the life of the unconscious is inseparable from the means of reading and analysis that give access to it, means that are particularly susceptible to being diversified and enriched through the contribution of new information and communication technologies, end quote. Significantly, the word enriched is not the description that immediately occurs to the reader in the final scene of Janice's failed suicide, which is perhaps a real demonstration of what it might mean for the militant analyst to be with the insane, as Guattari had suggested. In this light, Janice appears as an experiment with a post-identity subjectivity, an analytic procedure that, Guattari says, is an original system of expression, a specific cartography for a singular subjective problem. This problem produces, Guattari says, an impasse between individualized human subjectivity and the more distributed territories enabled by digital technology, and illustrates, quote, a fact self-evident to classic psychopathology, that is to say, that a psychotic love can never durably pin its alterity to a fixed identity, nor even to a stabilizing process of identification of whatever nature, end quote. On the one side, Guattari seems to suggest the techno-intelligence of the machinic unconscious is always, quote, destined to come off the rails of its existential avatars, end quote. While on the other, Janice's humanity is seduced by, quote, the incestuous game of the passage to transcendence, end quote. This impasse is created by the institutionalized and systemic forces separating the machinic unconscious of UIQ from its group enunciation, which forces it into a symbiotic relation with a single identity that drastically limits its enunciative and creative potentials in what Guattari calls an existential entrapment. Nevertheless, the text is not simply a morality tale warning of the dangers of overstepping our natural human limits, as much cyberpunk and science fiction is. The decompression typical of psychotic experience is affirmed and clearly connected to militant social formations, but the moral, if there is one, is that it has become caught in a kind of black hole of collapsed subjectivity and needs to be reconnected with possible universes, with pathic and partial objects able to restart its processes of heterogenesis. In this sense, the horrific final scene of Janice and UIQ merged in her body and unable to enunciate any stable subjective position even to a point beyond death, is not a cautionary tale warning us back from the edge, but a kind of realism showing us the utterly other future offered by schizoanalysis and gesturing towards the radical social transformation achievable through the subjective destructions attained through the passions of psychedelic love. Thank you.